Hello everyone, my name is Natalie Smiley and I'm going to take you through the sketching and painting and subsequent repainting of this book cover for Sleeping Beauty. This is the finished picture, which has taken me a few hours to paint, not least because I had to repaint it, and I'll explain why as we go through. So let's get into it. This is the Procreate video record tool. I draw a lot and paint quite a lot in Procreate on my iPad, purely because it's quite easy to cart around with me if I need to, and also it's quite comfortable sitting on the sofa sketching rather than sat on your desk, which is quite nice sometimes to put your feet up in front of a box set and do some drawing or whatever. So this is the finished sketch. As you can see, it's not too far off the finished painting, with the addition of some extra bits and pieces which I decided to remove. There's the sleeping animals, which were a lovely idea, but I couldn't quite get it to work with the colours that I had initially chosen, and actually it started to look quite busy and a bit cluttered and not quite as coherent and cohesive as I wanted it to look. So I decided to take them out in the end, but we'll get to that a little bit later on. So here I am, having already done a couple of thumbnails for Sleeping Beauty. You can see the top one is very, well, they're all very undetailed, but the top right hand side one would have been bordered by kind of tall dark trees in my head, and the bottom one was bordered by kind of vines and briars, similar to the finished piece, but in a slightly different shape, more of a kind of swooshing round type thing, with the sleepy animals. And in the end, I chose the middle one because I really like the idea of incorporating the gates to the castle from the fairy tale in the finished piece, and I had the idea to make the text almost part of the gates, which I thought seemed like quite a nice idea, so that's the one I picked in the end. So having picked the image we want to draw, I enlarge it and start to draw over it, and I spent quite a long time researching and looking at pictures of wrought iron gates because I haven't drawn very many of them in the past, and as it's the main focal point of this picture, I thought it would be a good idea to see how they fit, the curlicues and the swooshes fit together, because they don't just hang in mid-air, they fit to each other somehow, and it appears to be some kind of blob of iron in a nice shape, obviously, that kind of holds them together. So I was looking at swooshy ones and bits of curlicue and try to incorporate that into this gate, because it fits with the fairy tale romantic look that I'm going for, with heart shapes and briar rose vines. And here I am just trying to get my text to look right. Hand lettering is a completely different art of its own, so my idea was to settle the text in the gate and make it look as if it was almost part of the gate. And I'm not worried too much about getting the gates to look the same on both sides, because I'm just going to go and copy and paste it and flip it over and then kind of draw around it at the end. So here I've started to illustrate the the iron vines that decorate the top of the gate, and I wanted them to slightly mirror the vines that go around the outside of the picture to tie it all together, and of course the vines and brambles that cover the castle at the back as well. And see, this is me flipping it over. It's cheating really, but you can do that. It's allowed. And this prince will be pausing hesitantly at the gates, just about to push it open, and looking fearfully at the top, because wouldn't you look fearfully at a castle covered in brambles? And I know I have a habit of framing all my pictures with plants and trees and things. I just really like to do it, so I tend to do it quite a lot. And here you can see the animals. I've started to draw the sleeping animals, which I thought was a really lovely idea because it, everything surrounding the castle is supposed to be asleep, so all the people inside it, and I thought that would logically extend to the animals as well, so it would be quite cute to have sleeping woodland animals framing the picture as well as the plants. It didn't quite work out like that. It looks quite nice in the sketch, but it just looked too busy when I went to paint it, so I took it out in the end. And here I am yet again framing the frame with more vines. These vines are kind of mirrored throughout the rest of the picture in the iron and the brambles and vines at the back, so that it's logical that they extend to the front as well. And as is my habit, I'm framing the frame. I should say something here about how I draw plants and trees and little bushes and things. I tend to kind of sketch the outline of them just for a kind of idea of placement, and I tend not to really go into too much detail with them because I've always found when I've been painting them that I like to layer them up with different textures and different shapes and different colours, and so if I draw lots of line work I tend to lose the spontaneity of it, I suppose. Although maybe spontaneity is not the right word. It's kind of just an overall shape that I'm going for. So if I draw lots of line work, I tend to lose that. So what I tend to do is just paint them, and if they don't work, I delete the folder and do a different one with a different colour. Or it's really about kind of finding the best shape for that particular area and the best colour or the best texture, or maybe nothing at all. Maybe it just needs a bit of breathing room, you know. So I tend not to draw lots and lots of line work with lots of plants in them because I like to kind of just paint them in as I go. So when I was drawing the prints, I was looking at reference pictures of medieval garb, tunics and nice boots and big gloves and things. And the same thing goes for the castle. I mean, I'm English, so I love English castles, obviously, but there's something quite fairy tale romantic about European castles. So I was looking at Neuschwanstein Castle. It's the most beautiful turreted castle. It looks like something out of a Disney film. It's absolutely gorgeous. So that was kind of my main inspiration for the castle. Not that you'll see a huge amount of it. It's not very detailed. It's just kind of an idea of a shape in the background. But I really feel that European castles fit so much better into the fairy tale narrative than English castles do, and actually Scottish castles do as well. They're absolutely gorgeous. The baronial style castles are lovely in fairy tales too. So here I've imported the line work into Photoshop, and what I tend to do, my method of painting includes selecting all the layers that hold the line work, adding them into a folder, and then setting the folder mode to multiply and sitting on top of everything. So when you do start to paint, it's there guiding you a little bit, and you can still see it. And then not every time, most times I do a colour guide. So I have this really cool tool called Magic Picker, rather than using the Photoshop colours, and it helps you to lock a tone. So you pick a tone for your picture, and then you press the little button in the top right hand corner and it locks the colours to that tone, so it helps you kind of keep a cohesive look throughout your picture. You can turn it off if you want to and just, you know, and manage the colours yourself, and I do that sometimes, but it's a really handy tool to use, and it's very quick for selecting colours, different hues and different concentrations, and I really love it. I think it's great, so I use it quite a lot. So here I'm kind of laying out the colour ideas for this picture, and I thought that I had nailed the colour options for this picture, and I thought, oh, it looks lovely, and it did when I did this, but then a bit further in it starts to look a bit busy and a little bit cluttered, and the colours, there are too many colours and they're competing, and it doesn't quite work. So I'll show you what it looks like a little bit further on, because I paint quite a lot of this before I decide I don't like it, which is a pain. And then I repaint it. So I'll show you what it looks like a bit further on. So we're a bit further on, and you can see that I've started to block out the colour for the animals, and even though I decided not to paint them or keep them in, I thought it would be interesting to show how I paint the animals. So I work out the colours they're going to be, and then block out the colours, and sometimes I work on different layers, sometimes I work on the one layer. It really depends on whether I've remembered to create a new layer some other time. And the brushes I'm using are they're brushes by Marco Guadalupe. I do hope I'm pronouncing that right. I found Marco's brushes a while ago, and I was using a lot of Kyle Webster's brushes, and I still do use them quite a lot. But Marco's brushes are these are gouache and pastel brushes, and they're just beautiful. They're lovely brushes, and there's lots of them in this pack that I bought, and I don't actually use all of them. I just kind of have a few folders with a few favourites in them that I really like and use a lot. But there are a lot of them, so I tend to use his quite a lot at the moment, and I really like them because the textures that they give are lovely, dry, kind of brushy textures, and you can use them. They work very nicely with each other, and I tend to find that with my painting, at least, I work best and my paintings look the best when I've used a style like pastel and gouache, or watercolour and pencil, or two together work, or one by itself works quite nicely as well. But I really am feeling quite pleasantly disposed towards these brushes at the moment, and I think everybody maybe goes through stages where they prefer one brush to another brush. I really loved Kyle Webster's Gouache A Go-Go for a really long time, and I still do love it. I think it has a lovely texture. Actually, it's not dissimilar to the ones that Marco's brushes give you, so that's probably why I like it so much. But what I'm doing here is adding in the texture on top of the colour, and I'm just kind of lightly brushing it on top of the colour that I've put in. I should say that I'm using a Wacom Cintiq tablet. It's the small one, but it's done me well for a long time, so I'm not thinking of upgrading it just yet. And I really love them because you can draw directly onto the screen and see exactly what you're doing, and they've got excellent pressure sensitivity. And it's just a great way of working. It's probably why I quite like working with the iPad, actually, because it's very similar with the pencil. So here I am just kind of adding colours on top of other colours and textures on top of those, gently adding a bit of shade here and there. I should say, if there are long pauses of me not doing anything, it's probably because I've become distracted by whatever it is I'm watching. I'm actually watching Madam Secretary while I paint this, so if there's been a horrendous diplomatic incident, I tend to get distracted by that. Oh, here we go, look, this is me becoming distracted. Let me skip ahead a bit. There we go. I've skipped ahead slightly, so you can see I've started to paint the fur shapes, and it tends to be either a lighter or darker colour, using a quite scratchy pencil or dry gouache type brush, to paint the fur. And I tend to make it so that the lines follow the direction of the fur, which, you know, sounds quite self-explanatory, but if you do it the wrong way, it looks completely wrong. So you can help delineate the shapes of a, you know, it's flat, but you can make it look curved by the direction that you throw your pencil or your lines. So I tend to kind of scratch the lines around for the fur. So I've skipped ahead a little bit, and I've just put an image of as far as I got with the painting. I didn't like the way it ended up. I thought the colours in the beginning looked really nice and worked really well together, but when I got to this point, actually before this point, because I'd spent quite a while looking at it and painting and thinking, oh god, this isn't working, but I'll kind of persevere and see if it ends up coming together at the end, and I just couldn't. Sometimes it's good to persevere, sometimes it's just not worth it and it won't get you anywhere, and you should kind of listen to what your gut's telling you. The colours in this are not working with each other, it's too cluttered. You can't see the vines, the animals just look like they're floating in midair. Any number of things is wrong with it, and probably a better artist could fix it, but I just didn't feel like I liked it, and I didn't feel like it was working very well, and I decided to scrap it completely and start painting it again in different colours. I kept the gates because I didn't fancy painting those again, because they were finicky and delicate, and actually I really liked them. I liked the way they've turned out, so I decided to keep those. But the rest of it is gone, and this is how I started again. So I start by just getting rid of a lot of the clutter around the outside of the screen, and actually luckily what I'd done is imported the Procreate file as a PSD file, so it came with all its layers intact, which is pretty handy if you want to get rid of things rather than deleting them and having to redraw them. You can just select the layer and Bob's your uncle, it's gone. So I got rid of all the bushes, and I still quite liked the vines, so I decided to keep those, and the castle, and the major elements of the picture are all fine. It's just that they needed a little bit of breathing room and a little more cohesiveness and something to bring it all together. So I decided to get rid of all the kerfuffle around the outside. So skipping ahead slightly, I've redrawn in some bushes and some kind of general shapes and ideas for things. And now I'm going to pick the colour scheme that I think will tie it all together a little bit better. And what I've decided to do was, I'm terrible for picking blues and greens, and I mean I guess I have picked a blue. Bluey green for this picture, but I tend to just paint in blues and greens, so I thought if I kind of stray out of my comfort zone a little bit, it'll force me to maybe do a little better this second time round. And all my methods are the same, I paint the same way most of the time, with scratchy colours and textures and all that kind of stuff. It's just that sometimes if you use 2 or 3 colours in a picture, it kind of helps to bring it all together better. And I just locked the tone as well, so I found this blue that I really liked, and I thought, right, if I lock the tone, all the other colours that I pick will match in tone and will help to bring it all together. So I try a few different colour combinations, and I'll skip ahead a little bit so you can see a bit more of those. So I've decided to paint it pink, which is unusual for me. I don't normally paint my bushes and trees and plants pink, but a change is as good as a rest, as they say, and it's quite nice to pick different colours for things every now and then. And because I'd tried my usual way and failed so miserably, I just thought, well, what can go wrong if I do it a slightly different way to the way I normally do it? And what I decided to do is paint the foreground bushes a little bit darker and a bit more saturated, and then the mid ground are a bit paler, and then the all the rear bushes are slightly paler as well. And here I am trying to decide whether to keep. Actually, what I think I'm trying to do is decide whether or not I'm going to repaint the gates here. I think I ultimately decide not to do that, because why make work for yourself? So I think this green goes really nicely with this pink. It's a good contrast. And it's not a colour I use a huge amount, but I do think these two colours go beautifully together. And it has to be said that I haven't actually decided what colour I'm going to paint the prints at this point. And actually I don't figure out what colour I'm going to paint him until the very end, till I go to paint him. So I'll show you that a bit later on. So here I've finalised the colour scheme, and now I'm going to start to paint, and depending on what I'm painting, it kind of depends on what I choose to do first, but the method's always the same. I create a folder, and then a new layer, and then I start to paint. And I always try and name my layers, and I always try and name my folders. It depends on how long I've been painting, how well I keep up with that, because if I've been painting for a really long time and I'm getting to the end of a picture, I'm just like, oh, I've had enough, and just create a new layer and create a new folder and shove it in there. And the folders are so useful for kind of keeping keeping that bar neat and tidy, and it makes it easier to find things if you've got lots of layers. And I do paint on lots and lots of layers. I know some people only paint on one or two, but because I'm so indecisive, I like to be able to move things around at a later date if I want to. It gives me some more options. If someone doesn't like something in one place, I can move it to another place, or change its colour without having to repaint it. So it definitely has its benefits, painting on different layers and using folders and things. So I've laid in the base colour of the grass, and I think here I'm using one of Marco's brushes. I think it's a gouache brush, like a wet gouache brush, and it's a lovely one actually. I think it's in one of my favourite folders. It's a nice wet one that helps you lay in kind of big swathes of colours, but it's not so opaque that it doesn't kind of let the previous brush strokes shine through. So it's quite nice for laying in big blocks of colour. I'll skip forward a little bit so you don't have to see me painting for hours, because this did take a long time, doubly so because I had to paint it twice. So I've painted the sky, and I've painted a lot of the grass in, and I'm just reminding myself of the colours that I plan to use, because I'm going to decide what saturation and depth of colour I'm going to use to paint the bushes, and whether or not I'm going to use a slightly more orangey colour as well, because I maybe want to break it up a little bit. So I paint those colours and move them off to the side and just use them as like a swatch to pick from when I'm painting the plants. So I create a new folder for I actually forget halfway through this and start painting bushes in the wrong folder. So I create a folder for the left hand side and I create a folder for the right hand side for the bushes, because it's easier to move things around and find things if they're in their own folders, as I mentioned earlier. So I tend to start naming, after a while I tend to start naming things like front, left, rear, 3 or something, which means nothing at all, so it doesn't really help, but in the early stages it is quite useful to have them separated into their own folders so you can see where you are. And I thought it might be quite useful to show how I paint the plants, which I'm so fond of painting. I tend to use one of, I think, maybe 5 or 6 brushes and lay down the colours. And on this picture, this particular plant, I've decided to paint all on one layer and paint the shadow and the depth to it on top of that layer. But a bit later on I paint one in a similar shape and I use different layers for it. So God knows what my brain's going through when I'm doing these paintings, but I do obviously have a few different methods for things. There may be method to my madness, but I'm not sure about that. So I've laid in all the base colour, and now what I'm going to do is pick a slightly darker colour to lay in some shadows. So in my mind these rear leaves should be slightly darker, so you can see some shadows and some darker bits and pieces. So jumping ahead slightly, I finished that plant, and I'm picking the next colour for the plant in front of it, and it's going to be a kind of fluffier bush, I suppose. God knows what I'm doing here, testing the brushes out, I think. So I found a slightly drier gouache, no, I think this is a pastel brush, for this bush, because I want it to have a kind of cloud-like texture, I suppose. So the top, where the light would be shining through and the foliage becomes sparser, is lighter and it looks like there's light shining through it. And then further down, where the foliage is thicker and closer to the thicker branches, it's a bit darker. This isn't based on a real bush, I've just made this bush up in my head, so I've painted this style bush many times before, so I kind of have a feeling for how it would look in my imaginary world. And I quite like the way branches only extend so far and make a nice kind of pattern in themselves. So I'm not sure that bushes really look like this in the real world, but I quite like the branches making their own pattern and make, you know, as with the fox earlier on, the way the curves and the way they're drawn help give an overall shape to something that's flat. Oh look, I've become distracted again. Let me skip ahead. Something incredibly exciting must have happened on Madam Secretary, because I stopped painting for about 5 minutes. So I've finished the bottom bush, and looking at the top bush, I think I decided that it didn't have anywhere near enough definition. So I've kind of gone with this succulent-y cactus type feel for this one, with its kind of spiky edges, in a slightly paler colour, which helps to kind of delineate the leaves and give them a bit more shape and definition. So I treat all the leaves this way, and I'll skip forward a little bit so you can see what it looks like at the end. So I've obviously got a board over the other side, and now I'm going to start on the right hand side. So reminding myself of the colours that I've already chosen using the colour picker. I'm going to start painting these bushes now with, I think it's the same brush as the one on the left hand side, because they are supposed to be of the same family, same kind of the same kind of bush. So I'll skip forward a bit. So I decided to speed this up quite a lot so you could see things happen a lot quicker, because you don't want to see every single brush stroke. You'd be sat here for hours and hours. So I'm starting to fill in all the shapes with no line work in them, with some bushes. As I mentioned earlier, I tend not to draw them all in because I don't know what kind of shape I'm gonna want until I'm faced with it and I'm painting it. And halfway through a painting, sometimes I like to just go and Google plants and bushes, and I've got some books that I flick through for kind of leaf shape inspiration and kind of tree form inspiration. So I'm painting this in, and then I'm adding some detail in because it's nice as it is, but it needs a little bit of definition and a little bit of shape. And I tend to paint when I'm painting a bush like this. If I'm painting a leaf pattern on top, I take the base colour and then darken it slightly, or lighten it slightly, so that it kind of stands out a little bit from what I'm painting on top of. For the leaf shapes, I've laid in the base colour for the trees, and I'm using a gouache brush. I think it's like a pencil kind of shape, to lay down the base, and then on top of that I'm painting just what I think looks quite nice. You at the bottom of trees, they get a bit darker if you're kind of walking through a forest, especially. I remember this from when I used to live in Scotland, and I used to walk through the pine forests in the evening or at dawn especially. The light would shine through the pine forests, and the top third or the top half of the trees would have a bright band of light across them, and then the bottom part of the tree that was in shadow looked almost purple, and it was beautiful. So I tend to kind of try to capture that when I paint trees, and in doing that inadvertently in this picture, I seem to have made the trees look a little bit like the sun is either going down or coming up. I think it looks like it's coming up a little bit. So they're kind of romantic-y kind of colours, and I like to add texture and shape with lines on the tree bark itself. Again, the trees in Scotland, the pine trees, had these beautiful bark lines in like pattern in the bark, and I'm not doing it justice by any stretch of the imagination with my paintings, but it was absolutely gorgeous. So I like to try and paint a pattern onto the tree trunks. Here you can see that I am thieving from my own picture the gates that I'd already painted, and inserting them appropriately behind the plants. I suddenly had the notion that they would look much better white rather than the wrought iron colour that they were supposed to be, and I think I flit backwards and forwards a few times before I decide what colour I'm going to keep them, and actually start to paint them again and then think, what madness is this, and actually steal them properly with their layers intact the second time around. And I think the way I change the colour is by doing a colour adjustment. If you hit Control and U on your keyboard when you want to change the colour of something and check the colorise box, and use the sliders, you can you can change the colour of whatever's in your layer. It's quite handy. It doesn't keep the tone like the Magic Picker does, as far as I'm aware, so you have to be careful what you're doing. But it's a useful way of changing the colour of something quickly without having to repaint it or use another method to change the colour. So I like it dark in kind of a wrought iron colour, but because I've used such different colours to the colours I started with when I originally painted it, I decided that it wasn't going to work. And the main reason for that was because when I started to paint these vines, I had to make sure that they were going to be visible between the wrought iron and the bushes, and if they were kept dark it just wasn't going to work. So as you can see here, I've painted it and decided that I didn't like it, so I've gone back to the pale colour gates, and I'm going to paint the vines a more realistic colour, if you can call it realistic, I suppose, in a fairy tale with pink bushes everywhere, but I think the vines look better green. So that's what I decided to do, and actually I think the cohesiveness of the picture works much better as a result of that decision. And I do this a lot. I paint something and think, God, that colour's horrible, and either repaint it or change it completely. And I don't think there's anything wrong with that. I mean, it's difficult to do that if you're working for a client, obviously, and they've asked for particular colours or a particular way of painting. So you kind of have to make it work. But when you're working on personal pieces like this, you do have the freedom to chop and change, and to change your mind on things and change the way things are painted and designed. And I take full advantage of that quite a lot with my own work. So when I first started painting these briars in the original picture, I am using a reference, just because it's something that I like to do for plants sometimes if I'm painting a particular type of plant, but I'm not trying to make them photorealistic by any stretch of the imagination. I just wanted to kind of see how they grew, and I stopped using my own reference for some reason the first time I painted these, and I didn't notice that the leaves start smaller and get bigger up the vine as they grow, which is a little bit counterintuitive to me, because when I'm growing things in my garden, for instance, the leaves at the bottom are bigger than the leaves at the top of the plant usually. So on these little kind of spurs, the big leaves are at the end and the little leaves are at the beginning of the spur. So when I repainted these, I kind of tried to keep to that premise for these vines. I skipped ahead slightly because there was lots of vine painting occurring. I don't think you can see that in real time, but I think hopefully you agree now that the colours and their cohesiveness work a lot better than the previous painting. The trees, like I mentioned earlier, look like they've been kind of lit up from behind by a rising sun or whatever. So now I'm just painting in a bit more texture on the grass and a bit more of the shadows that I think might appear. And I'm going to start painting in the roses very, very soon as well. So just picking a colour for those, and I think they would be quite a hot pink. There are lots of different types of briar roses, and I think a pink one looks quite nice with the colour scheme that I've picked. I think a white one would get lost, and I mentioned on Twitter earlier on that I'm absolutely horrible at painting yellow, so yellows are out, and I think pink just looks quite nice. It's quite romantic. So I'm going to paint all the roses, and I'll skip ahead slightly. So all the roses have been painted, and now I'm going to paint the grass texture using a brush called AD Borrowdale. This is a nice kind of pencil brush, and the way I paint grass is to kind of layer the different shapes together to make it look as if there's lots of depth and movement. And I frequently get it wrong and have to start again because I've got carried away with myself and drawn in the wrong direction or whatever, or flipped the screen around so you can't quite see where you're headed. So that's the way I paint grass. And what's next is the briars and vines surrounding the castle. So I wanted them to be kind of making almost a pattern, but not really, just something that looks pleasing to the eye. You know, they flow towards the castle and almost frame it with the vines. So I'll skip ahead so you can see how this ended up. So I've painted the vines around the castle, and now I think, getting a little bit fancy with the lighting here, because I thought that the dawn idea was quite a nice one, so I thought, I'll see what I can do with the lighting, and I just can't get it to work. It's not working at all. Doesn't look good, and it doesn't quite go with the almost flat, low detail look that I'm going with. So I abandoned that quite quickly. Skipped ahead slightly here, because I've decided to paint the roof tiles slightly darker and more saturated version of the base for the castle. And my only concession to the dawn idea here was to paint the top of the spires and the top of the roofs a slightly paler colour, which looks quite nice, as well as kind of hints at the dawn idea that I had. So here I've skipped ahead a little bit and I've finished the castle, and I've decided to use a mask to give the impression that the grass is growing over the castle. The mask is applied to the folder that contains all the layers for the castle, so it affects all those layers, and it just helps to show that it's not sitting on top of the hill, it's kind of it's contained kind of underneath it, and the grass is growing over it almost. So I've painted the some more brambles around the castle, and I've decided to add some mist, some early morning mist, because I've obviously really sold myself on the idea of the fact that this picture is set at dawn, and there's always mist at dawn, so in fairy tales at least. So I've decided to paint a kind of hazy mist over everything, and now I'm going to paint the leaves on the trees, and at this point I haven't actually decided what colour I'm going to paint the trees, the leaves for the trees. So I just pick a colour and decide what I think looks best. And even though it's zoomed in here, so you can only see a portion of the picture, I've got two screens. I've got the Cintiq and I've got a big monitor. And on the big monitor there's the navigator screen, which is useful because it's kind of colour corrected, so it's more of it's a better idea about how it'll look when it's printed out, whereas the Cintiq doesn't show that kind of depth of colour. And it's useful because the navigator shows the whole project all at once, so while my screen is zoomed in I can just glance up to my other screen, which is right in front of me, and see the whole thing and see how the colours are looking with each other, and see what kind of works and what doesn't. And you may have noticed that I have become distracted again, so I'll skip forward a little bit. So I've skipped forward and I've mostly finished the leaves now, and I decided to paint the inner leaves a dark colour and the outer leaves a slightly paler colour, because it's quite a nice way of adding a bit more pattern to what can sometimes be quite a flat look. And I actually decided that I didn't really like the colour that I'd picked, so I'm adding an adjustment layer above the leaf layer, but I don't think it really works very well, so I'm going to change the actual leaf layer using the hue and saturation adjustment to a green, which blends in quite nicely. I think the orangey yellow was a bit too autumnal, and I'm not sure that it worked. It worked quite quite as well as I wanted it to. So I'm adding a little bit more depth in now with more brambles and thickets of leaves and spiny branches and things, because I think it needed a bit more framing, because you can never have too much framing in my pictures apparently. So having finished the extra framing, I've moved on to the prints, and what I think I've done here is hidden most of the other lines, or the ones that are visible to me anyway, in this kind of part of the painting, so that I don't kind of get distracted by them, except for the ones for the prints. And I'm using another one of Marco's brushes. And for me, for an element this small on a page, it doesn't really make sense to outline every element of him. I do some outlining on him, but not a huge amount. And I do outlining quite a lot in my work, but I really don't think something as small as this needs a huge amount of outlining, so I'm just going to kind of keep him unoutlined for the most part. And here is where I decide kind of what colours I'm going to use to paint his clothes, giving him a bit of blush, because you can't go wrong with a bit of blush. So I decided to use a blue, which is characteristic of me, I suppose, sticking to my blues and greens. And I'm trying, because he's so small, to only use a couple of brushes with him, and because personally I think that if something is this small, it's quite nice to just use one or two brushes to kind of stop your eye getting too distracted, and that, I think that goes for the whole picture actually. Sometimes if you use too many brushes and too many things, it can become a little bit hard to look at. So I tend to stick to a few chosen brushes that I really like at that point in time, and I've actually got a folder, one that says line work and one that says details and one that says washes, and I've got I think there's 3 in the line work one and another 3 or 4 in the details one, and maybe 6 in the washes. So I tend to kind of use the same brushes all the way through, to kind of keep that cohesiveness. And here I'm just scribbling some texture on top of him. I think I'm using the Borrowdale brush here again, the Borrowdale pencil, which is nice. And sometimes what I do is I turn the opacity down, so that you get more of the texture coming through. Because if you use it, depending on the brush, if you use it at 100% opacity, you scribble, and then you've scribbled too much, and you can't see the texture kind of shining through underneath it. So if you turn the opacity down, you can scribble and then scribble a bit more on top, and it kind of shines through. And what I've obviously done here is yet again become distracted by some sort of diplomatic crisis in the White House. So I'll skip forward a little bit. So having skipped forward a little bit, I'm just painting a little bit of detail onto his tunic and, what would you call this, a jerkin? I've probably got that wrong. But the trick here for me was to add enough detail that it looked like it was detailed, but not so much that you couldn't really make it out, because he is quite a small element. And I'm adding a little bit of shading and shadow to him to make him appear that he has a bit more depth. And the same goes for when I'm painting the sword. I don't really want to have loads of outlines on it, so the shapes have to be quite simple, and the colours have to be quite blocky, I suppose. And there is scope to add texture and lines and things, but you don't really want to be adding too much if the element's this small, with my style, because it just doesn't work. You can't really see it for one, and then if you paint the lines in just now and then you show it on Twitter or whatever, the detail's lost anyway, so there's not really much point. I've waited right until the end to tell you how I work, what size of document I work on. I tend to work really huge. I work at 400 dpi usually, and my poor computer complains at me, but I tend to work bigger than A3 in document size, and I'm not sure that it's strictly necessary, but definitely not for print. You know, it's not the kind of thing that you want to do if you're going to be, you know, sending it off to an editor or whatever. They don't want it at 400 dpi and massive, but I do tend to work massive and then shrink it down for them when I'm working with clients. So, having finished the prints, I've decided to add yet more framing in the form of more briars to the front of the document. So I create a new layer in front of the folders that house all the other layers, and start to paint the briars. I don't want too many really. I just want a few to kind of add a little bit of depth in the foreground. We don't want to go crazy here. So here we are right at the end, and everything's looking good, and all we need to do is add in the author's name. There are loads of different Sleeping Beauty stories and authors, but I've decided to use Charles Perrault instead of the Brothers Grimm. And you can see I've created a layer underneath the layer that I'm going to use to actually write on, just to give me an idea of the size of the letters I want to write. Not the shape or anything, just to kind of lay them out so they don't get cramped or don't run out of space. It's quite a good way of blocking out where you want your words to be. And look, I've decided to do some more framing, so totally out of character, I think you'll agree. So here's the finished picture. Thank you so much for watching. If you've watched the whole thing, well done you. If you've got any questions, or you'd like to know a bit more about how or why I do things, then head over to Twitter and I'll answer any questions you've got. I'm at natsmillie. Thanks for watching.